Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kendall Trump with Grain Journal Magazine in Decatur, Illinois. Welcome to Getting the Most of the Grain Grading System. This is the third in a series of webinars to be presented by GEAPS and Grain Journal Magazine in 2019. Unbiased third-party agencies conduct official grade inspections using established and proven standards, procedures, and techniques to determine grain quality. The inspection process is intense and quality control is strict, from sampling and inspecting through data entry and billing. Today's webinar will acquaint you with the rich history of the grain inspection industry and how it helps reduce risk to producers, elevators, exporters, and the rest of the grain industry. Today's webinar is sponsored by M&M Specialty Services. M&M specializes in protecting your people and your products with the best in quality and affordability in personal protection products, grain protectants, fumigants, and services. They are based in Leavenworth, Kansas. Our webinar is also sponsored by VAA LLC, who has provided engineering and design services in the agribusiness industry since its founding in 1978. Working with owners, equipment vendors, and design-build contractors, the firm specializes in bulk commodity handling facilities, including slip-form design, material handling, transportation, and export. They are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Our presenter today is Kia Adams-Mickish. Kia is the Vice President of NDGI Official Grain Inspection, giving accurate and consistent inspection of agricultural products since 1968. NDGI serves both the buyer and the seller of agricultural commodities. Kia is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management. For over 5 years, she has sat on the board of directors for the American Association of Grain Inspection and Weighing Agencies. Please feel free to ask questions today by typing them into the questions box at the right-hand side of your screen at any time during our webinar. We will be answering your questions during a Q&A session following our presentation. We do have one polling question for you today. How many people are viewing at your facility? Thank you for your participation. As a note, today's webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our website, grainnet.com, within 24 hours. All registrants will also receive an email containing a link to our recording. At this time, Kia, can you please do a voice check?
I'm here.
Great, we can hear you perfectly. Now, can you also please show us your opening screen?
Yep.
There we are. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Kia Adams-Mickish.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. As she said, my name is Kia Mickish, and I'm the Vice President here at NDGI. I am very excited to talk to you about how to get the most out of the grain grading system. Honestly, when I talk to people and they ask what I do for a living, letting them know I work for a grain inspection, I kind of get the deer in headlights look a lot. And so I really enjoy getting to tell people about our industry and what it can do for everyone. It's something that isn't extremely known, how big of an impact it has on everyone within the agricultural industry. So I really hope that you can get something out of my presentation today. NDGI started in Fargo, North Dakota in 1968. We are, as Kendall mentioned, we're an unbiased third party that determines the quality of grain between buyers and sellers of grain. We started out in a tiny space in North Dakota and since 1968 have expanded into servicing customers in 8 states, and we have 7 offices across 4 states. Currently, we grade almost every commodity under FGIS except for one because it's not in our territory. But those would include things like wheat, corn, soybeans, peas, lentils, to just name a few. So as I mentioned, we work under FGIS, and this is a relationship that I really like to highlight how it works because it can be a little complex for people. So us as NDGI, we are a private entity. We are a private company, but we do work on behalf of the Federal Grain Inspection Service. Federal Grain Inspection Service was established by Congress in 1976 to manage the National Grain Inspection System, which was initially brought out in 1916. So their mission is to promote the interests of industry and general welfare of people in the United States. That's pretty general, so we like to section it out into 4 different items to discuss. The first one is a system. They provide an official inspection system for grain. They establish official United States standards for grain. They promote uniform application by official inspection personnel, and they regulate the weighing of grain shipped in interstate or foreign commerce. Now, each of these I'll go over in a little bit more depth for you. So the first is the system. As noted, it's a little unique of a system where we are comprised of, there are private companies that do work on behalf of FGIS, which is a division of the USDA. There are states that do this under their Department of Agriculture. So a few examples of those would be Missouri, North Carolina, or Virginia. And then there are also federal points. And as you can see here on this map, this is a map of all the different people that take part in the Federal Grain Inspection Service. So every one of us have specific territories that we have to stay within. And that's really to help the integrity of the official system and make sure you're getting the most unbiased results that you can for your grain. So for us, each one of these codes is a different company or state regulation. So we're code NR, if you're able to see that. And that shows exactly where we're able to service elevators or service farmers, container loading facilities, barge loading facilities. And each one of our agencies does things the exact same way as far as how we're grading your grain. And we have some examples of the type of work that agencies like ours do is on most days we'll go out and we do service requests for grain elevators, for an example. And when the second their train comes in, our crew goes out there and we start sampling their train for them. So if it's a corn train, we'll start getting corn samples for every single rail car that they do, and then we will start grading it on site for them in most instances. And what a grade is, that would be things determining like the moisture content of the corn, the broken corn and foreign material, different types of damages within the corn. So we're doing that a lot of times on site, like I said, to help these elevators really make their grain selling more profitable. And they're able to see what the exact specs are of the train that they're trying to ship out. Some other examples that many of the other agencies do among ours is doing sampling and grading for container loading facilities, anything that might be going over to other countries. They do sampling on barges and trucks as well. Now FGIS, the federal side of things, they are these larger dots on the screen, and these are what are called field offices. The one that's right in the middle in Kansas City is the office that oversees all of us agencies throughout the nation, but then the other dots are mainly export locations, and they're usually grading ships at those sites. So that's a little bit about kind of a visual picture of what the system looks like within the Federal Grain Inspection Service. A little breakdown, there are, out of those agencies on the map, 33 of those are private entities and 12 are state agencies. And out of the inspections, all those official agencies across there, we all do about over 5.6 million inspections in a year. And the FGIS employees at those export facilities, they do over 157,000 inspections. A lot of times the grain is touched many times throughout its journey. So if you have grain that's being sold in North Dakota, or it's being grown in North Dakota, that farmer a lot of times is coming to an agency like ours to determine what it is that they're growing, what the quality of their grain is. Then it can go into a grain elevator, and it's then sampled and graded again before it's getting into the elevator, so they maybe know which bins to put it in. Then they go and how to pay the farmer as well. Then they go of outbound rail cars that could be getting sold to the PNW, and then it's usually graded again there as it's probably going onto a ship. So it's very exciting. The grain can change a lot in its journey, so it's very important that people are making sure they know what the quality of the grain is, no matter where it is at in its journey. So FGIS is, as I mentioned, it's under the federal government and under the USDA. And so it's funded in a few different ways. There are normal things like it has appropriations through money through Congress, but it also has user fees. Now, I like to bring this up because it tends to be a hot topic if people know what they are. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of background on what these are because it does impact the industry. The user fees they're really there to collect money to cover the costs of oversight for official agencies. They are based on the weights or the standard weights of different carriers like a rail car or a barge, and we pay per metric ton of everything that we inspect. So for example, if we do one rail car, that's approximately $1.10, give or take. There's a lot of calculations that go into this, but I like I said, a lot of times, a lot of different places that I've spoken at, this has been a question, and that's come up a few different times because that does impact pricing. And just to know that's how we all work together to make sure that this official system is working how it does. A few years ago, though, the user fees were suspended, but just to get things back in line, but they will be coming back within the next few years probably when it's within a certain reserve of being between 3 months and 6 months of operating costs. So I talked a little bit about the system and how that looks, but it's really important to know what we do and how we do what we do. And really what we go off of is the standards. And FGIS, as I mentioned, has intense standards, and it's a very big division of FGIS of making sure that things are as detailed as possible, everything's outlined so that if you are in Kansas or you're in North Dakota, you should be getting the same type of service and grades from everywhere you go. There are rules and standards on everything we do, which is one of the main ways of keeping the system uniform. The first standard that we go by and we live by is the United States Grain Standards Act and the Agricultural Marketing Act. Those two acts tell us what we need to do, what we need to abide by. And from there, the handbooks will go into a lot more detail. So handbooks are, they're pretty lengthy. They have a lot of information. They tell you things like running a moisture. You have to go through all these different steps and all these different ways to deal with the equipment in order to run a moisture. I always knew these were intense when I first got in the system, when I first got into grain inspection, but when I first came onto NDGI, we're a family business that's been around for a while, and when I first came in, I was told that I was going to be on the business side. I wasn't allowed to touch the grain grading or anything that had to do with that, or a lot of things with FGIS that other people were handling that, and I needed to run the business and help do that. And my father and grandfather are, well, they know me quite well, and I like to learn things. And so what I did is I'd go home every night and I'd print off these handbooks and I would just read them every night to learn the system. Looking back, they probably did that on purpose to get me to learn more. But the point of this is when I printed off these handbooks, to just give you an idea, it was, when I'm speaking in front of people, I like to give them a little visualization of how big it is, but it easily can be a room's length of pages printed off. That's how many regulations and rules that we have to abide by. So a lot of times customers will say, well, I want to know exactly what are the rules you go by. And I can't easily go through that. This is something that grain inspections go through years and years and years of training on to learn what we do and how to do it, and many different specialized people within each agency to make sure that it's all being handled correctly. So a few examples of the handbooks that we go by are, there's an equipment handbook, and that one's going through every piece of equipment that we look at. They're all completely regulated by FGIS on which ones we can use, and it tells us how to fix them, how to make sure that they're within tolerance. We have sampling handbooks. Those are telling you exactly how to probe a truck. There are randomized ways to do things, certain degrees you have to do things, and each of these, when talking to people, a lot of times they think maybe it would be a 10-page handbook to talk about sampling, when in reality it can be 50 to 100 or more pages for each one of these handbooks. And this is basically, if we have any questions at all, these are what we go to. It's extremely important, like I said before, because you want to make sure that when that farmer is getting a grade in North Dakota, that it's going all the way through the line of being the same type of quality and getting the same results. And that's why we have so many handbooks to go by. Another type of standard that is important to us and to FGIS is personnel. You can write all the rules and regulations you want, but if you want them to be followed correctly, you need to make sure that the personnel know how to do those standards and have different checks and balances in place with them. They are a few of the things that we do within FGIS is if you have, say you're a grain elevator and you have a person coming out from NDGI to sample your grain or to grade your grain, that person, if it's touching grain in any capacity, needs to be licensed for those specific things that they're doing. And not a lot of people know that. So if you have a person that is licensed in knowing how to get samples from a mechanical diverter that's going into rail cars, that does not automatically mean that that same person could probe a rail car to get a sample out of it, unless they're licensed for both of those things. When they're getting licensed, they have a 30-day period that they really have to start training and learn what they can through the handbooks and through hands-on training. And at the end of that 30 days, they have to take a written exam that's produced by FGIS, and then they also have to be proctored through practical exams. So we have to watch them and make sure that they can do everything under that handbook for that licensed item from A to Z without major assistance, so that they're able to go out and do it on their own. So when you have someone coming out to your facility, you should feel confident that they know what they're doing because they've gone through a rigorous training to learn that. There's also renewals. So every 3 to 5 years, depending on the commodity, they have to be renewed. So you can't just take a license and have it the rest of your life. You have to make sure that you're constantly renewing it, making sure that you have everything in place. And if a person is no longer with the company, the agencies are to suspend those licenses, so you don't have people that aren't getting the same type of oversight we are from FGIS out there doing work for you. Before we hire anyone as well, we make sure that they have no conflict of interest. So a common thing would be if someone has a financial interest in or lives with someone who has a financial interest in any type of grain that could be influenced by the quality of the grain. So you always want to know that if there's an elevator right outside of here and we had an employee working for us that also worked there, if that were to be allowed, that person could maybe get bonuses or whatever incentives based off of that by, for lack of a better word, fudging numbers. And you don't want to ever feel like that's something that could happen in the system. Everything that we do is to make sure we're maintaining an unbiased environment. The other thing, for those that have used services from a place like NDGI or any other official agency, you know that you get a certificate once we've done the analysis on your grain. And a lot of people see these, but they may not always know the importance of what the certificate can do for them. So I like to make sure that people understand when I'm doing these conversations, they understand what they can do with that certificate and what it truly means for them having that piece of paper in their hands or on their computer. These certificates are basically like an insurance policy where the buyer or the seller can show that an unbiased third party graded their grain. There are a lot of other labs or inspection offices within the United States that have certificates, if you will, but they're usually called certificate of analysis or a few different things. But unless it has that FGIS seal or the USDA name on there, they don't have the same backing. And what that backing is that these certificates are actually prima facie and they hold up in court. And because of all the different checks and balances that I'll explain later in the conversation, you know that what's on that certificate is what your grain is at that given moment. There are very strict rules on how many times a sample can be rerun between re-inspections and appeals. Say you do get your first result and you want someone to retest it again. That's what a re-inspection is. We're able to do that in most commodities one time for you. This is important to make sure that as a buyer of grain, you know that maybe the seller isn't just continually retesting it until maybe there's one that's more favorable to them. So it really keeps that unbiased as well. But then there's also an appeal. And if you have that certificate, there are some parameters with it, but you're able to appeal it to the federal office, and that's in Kansas City usually. And you can have the federal grain inspection inspectors grade your grain there as well. So it's important to know that you have those different options to make sure that you are getting what you need to get for your grain. Another thing with these certificates is that they are extremely standardized, literally down to the placement of a period in a sentence or a semicolon. And so that's very important because just like many of the other things, you know that if you're getting a certificate in one area, you're going to get a similar certificate in another area, which helps you sell your grain a lot easier by knowing everyone knows what those things mean on the certificate when they're buying and selling grain. So most important, the piece that gets these together, the system and the standards, they both play into how FGIS can make everything uniform for the industry, which is the ultimate goal for everyone that's involved under FGIS, making sure everything is uniform. There's a lot that goes into this besides the system and the standards. And a lot of these are through checks and balances within FGIS and the agencies. This is something where for those of you that work with us, work with different grain inspections, you probably knew a good chunk of what I was just talking about. But a lot of people don't understand or know that all the different things and the communications that go on between agencies and FGIS. For us, I know that I'm talking to at least multiple different people within the Federal Grain Inspection Service every single day. So we're always communicating to make sure that we're doing the best service that we can and making sure it is as accurate as possible. This isn't a system that just licenses you and lets you be. And there are a few different ways that they do these checks and balances. And the first one, which I love, is frequent monitoring. So we have, say we do 1,000 samples in a day. They may look at 5 to 10 of those samples, if not more, and they're completely randomized. They tell us which ones we have to pick. We send those samples in. We have to send them in that day or the next day. They get shipped down to Kansas City, and they will take their inspectors that are federally licensed and go through and grade everything again. And we get reports on those. Every day we see what our results are, and we get accuracy percentages, and we know where our agency stands in that. If you're not within a certain percentage of accuracy, there are definitely repercussions that can happen from that, and they're working with you to make sure that you elevate above that so that everyone in the industry knows that they're getting accurate results. Those are things for grades, but then you have the extra tests that we do, like proteins, mycotoxins, falling numbers, all those extra tests, which are also very important to be accurate and very precise testing. For monitors, we actually do reference samples every single day that a protein is ran. And it's about 45 minutes of checks every single day on the machine before we even run one protein. Then we also have to send in weekly samples to FGIS, and so that they can verify that ours is matching up with theirs as well. So there's 2 checks on proteins. For mycotoxins, we send in weekly samples for them to test on more scientific measures that take a lengthier time to run, to always make sure that we're going against the reference method and giving what we need to our customers. Another checks and balance is through constant communication. Like I said, FGIS is always talking to the official agencies. We are talking every single day about many different items and always making sure we're on the same page. They do these through simple emails, and we do conference calls frequently, but also there's many trainings throughout the year that official agencies are expected to go to. So you have quality assurance specialists that are watching over our inspectors within the company. Those individuals then have to go to Kansas City, say once a year, to make sure that their line for grading is exactly on with the federal inspection. Then we have training on how to comply with the handbooks, how to do equipment. There's just always something that is going on with those. We also do internal audits, and those are done annually, but really they're done throughout the year. They're a process throughout the year where we have to do a strict format to cover the processes that we do and how we're making sure we are following the processes they do. Then they have compliance reviews, which happen every two or so years. It kind of depends on your designation, and each of these agencies, which I didn't mention before, is designated or delegated. So you actually have essentially a time limit for when you're allowed to do this, and compliance will come in and do very comprehensive reviews on your agency to make sure that everything is in spec with how they want it to be. And these, if you don't do well on the compliance review, you can lose your designation. So that's the other way that they show that they're not just saying you need to do these things, they take action on it, and everyone makes sure that they do it. Something else that, for those of you that are in grain elevators or container loading facilities, something you probably notice is we go out to the facilities about every 6 months or more often and do complete workups on the equipment that we do. And that's another difference with official agencies versus other labs, is you're constantly looking at these machines. One thing, a lot of people, when they're talking about it, like, okay, a moisture machine. For those of you who've ran it, for those of you who haven't ran it, you basically take a sample, run it through, dump it into a machine, press a button, and it tells you a moisture result. It seems very simple, but through everything that we're doing, there's actually a big handbook on moistures. And many people don't believe that that's even possible, because we're always told to look at, we have to clean things in certain ways. When we do check samples to go out every 6 months, we have reference samples sent to us from FGIS, and we have to be within 0.15% of that reference sample to actually keep it in tolerance. Every 6 months or more frequently, we have to do new calibrations on the machines. We have to keep logs on maintenance. They have to be maintained in certain ways. And that's where, when you bring a sample in to get a moisture done at an official agency, sometimes it can be different than what is done on someone else's machine, even though it's the same exact machine, because we're always having those cross-references with FGIS, and that goes for all the equipment that we do. So with this, that's really what makes things very different, is there's just constant checks and balances to provide that unbiased result. The last part that FGIS looks at is it monitors the weighing of, it can be the weighing of containers, the weighing of rail cars, trucks, ships. There's a lot of different regulations around that, and to make sure that everyone knows that the amount of grain they're being told they're getting is the amount of grain they're actually getting. There are different regulations on how to check the scales before we weigh things, how to verify scale tickets are correct. among many other items. For those of you that have scales, I'm sure you're very familiar with working with FGIS every so often to get your scales certified. So that's something that we're not able to give you weights if we're doing official weights unless there is that check from FGIS that came out and verified your scales are correct. So that's another division within FGIS. Now I told you I'd give you a little bit more on what information for you guys of what could apply to you and whatever part of the industry you're in. There are something to note is FGIS deals with the registrations for export. So if you are an exporter of grain, that the United States Grain Standards Act requires all persons buying grain for sale in export markets to register within the FGIS. There are some exemptions to that. So for people who only occasionally buy or sell grain or are transporting grain for hire or buying grain for feeding or processing, not for resale, there are certain exemptions for that, so you don't have to get the registration. But it is definitely something that if people have questions on of, you're exporting grain and you're not sure if you have this certificate or not in order to export grain, the FGIS Compliance Division handles that, and they can look into seeing if your company or where you're at really needs to be registered for export. And that's something too, our email address will be at the end of this. If you ever have any questions, I can direct you in the right way as well. There's also the United States Grain Standards Act. The majority of it is on how we're supposed to be running our agencies and how we need to do things and how it's all laid out from Congress. But there is a large section on what is expected from the industry. And this is something that I've given talks on more in depth for people. A lot of our customers, I like to go out and let them know what these are. With the length of this webinar, I can't get it extremely in depth with it, but it is something that I highly encourage people to go look at or look into a little bit more. Some of the things that are considered prohibited acts under the United States Grain Standards Act for the industry as a whole are falsifying, improper influence, grain quality, and disguising. So what falsifying means is it is illegal to falsify an official certificate. It's illegal to falsify putting an FGIS mark or knowingly attempt to create misrepresentation within that. And so that's where FGIS backs everyone that is having their grain graded, is to show that people aren't just making things that look like it. So you know that when you get the certificate, it really is from an official agency. Improper influences is, it says straight under the Act that no person may improperly influence or attempt to influence official personnel. So that would be anyone that works for an agency, anybody that works under FGIS. Each of our employees are required to carry around what's called a brag card, and and it has numbers on it that say if we were to be bribed, these are numbers to call. We definitely nowadays don't see things like that happening, but it's very good for people who are new in the industry to know that this is an industry that it's a very strict industry on how we do things. And say there is an inspector grading on site somewhere, they can't have people coming up to them saying like, really, like, are you sure that you want to put that for the BCFM? Any sort of ways like that is improper, and we can't have that to make sure that we're saving the integrity of the system. There is a section on grain quality, and that has a discussion on dockage and foreign material recombination, what you can and cannot add into your grain. And then there's also disguising. It's illegal to disguise your grain, and that would be the contamination of sound and pure grain with non-grain or unfit grain or grain that exceeds FDA regulations. A few examples of this would be where if someone has corn that's really sour, it is illegal to pour bleach on that grain, because that is something that it's not sound and pure grain. It's something that could be going to cattle, and they don't want to the farmers aren't and the ranchers aren't wanting their cattle to eat bleach. That is something that as official agencies we're trained to watch out for and make sure there are a ton of different examples that could be given in how to disguise grain. But for sake of time, that's one of the examples that could happen. And for people to know in industry that, especially those that are new to it, that if we see this, we actually have to talk with FGIS, and compliance officers may come out to your facility. So I like to encourage people to do things as by the book as possible, and we're just all in this together to make sure that the industry is running very smoothly and nobody is getting hurt in the process. There are also things that may exceed FDA regulations. So that's something that the FGIS works with the FDA in a memorandum to watch out for things like the bleach in the grain, or if there's too many of a certain type of insect or insect damaged kernels. There's a whole list of different things that we look out for and that we need to work with the FDA if we see anything above those thresholds. And if, again, with that, if there's ever any interest in what those different things are, I'd be more than happy to send out those directives that have that information so everybody is in the know of what we need to look out for, even if it's not being asked for. So as I've noted multiple times throughout this, everything that we do within the official system, everything FGIS does, everything official agencies do, is to ensure that you as the buyers and sellers of grain are getting the same results no matter where you're at. And we want to make sure through having these checks and balances and the different rules and regulations with the standards that, like I said, if you go to North Dakota or Kansas, Iowa, wherever it may be, that you're going to get the same thing, and you can really have confidence and use us as official agencies to help promote your grain and know that what you're getting is a true statement there. So that's my presentation on the official system, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, Kia. That concludes the presentation portion of today's event. We will now begin our Q&A session. If you have not yet submitted your questions, please do so at this time. Okay, Kia, our first question. Are there any commodities that NDGI does not cover?
NDGI specifically, I believe the only one we don't do is rice, because we don't have that in any of our territories. But many other official agencies do a lot of testing on rice.
Okay, great. Our next question, and it's a little bit of a long one, so please bear with me here. With all the recent scares of contaminated food products, I am wondering if there are similar concerns with the grain, especially since grain finds its way into many different consumable products. Historically, there was a case in 1953 of wheat imported into the U.S. being labeled as unfit for human consumption, yet it found its way into American flour. As far as I can tell, there were very few safety concerns related to such contamination. Can you comment on that? Maybe how grain differs in terms of foodborne illness risk?
Yes, I'd love to. For whoever asked that, I'm sure you know there's a lot that goes into that. But for our part specifically, I've seen a very big increase in people testing their grain over and over. It used to be something that I would assume maybe people just used for their contracts to get going, but people really are taking even things within a tenth very seriously. So I see a lot of the toxin testing now, and that came about a long time ago, but it's done very frequently now, and those toxin tests the main ones are to make sure that it's not getting into livestock, and so people's cattle, their hogs, if they're feeding their grain to that, you'll find a lot of places getting extensive testing on these toxins, because what it can do is there's different types of aflatoxin or vomitoxin. If it gets into the cattle, it can give them certain types of cancers. It can give them, it can kill them. It can make the hogs sterile so they can't produce anymore. And they are, so it is definitely a safety concern, and I see like our customers specifically are very serious about it, and they work very closely with us to make sure that each batch of grain is being tested, and there are certain known thresholds for different types of uses of grain, and it's a lot more strict as you become going into things that are potentially into food. Not a lot, like the corn, a lot of that goes to livestock, but when you're getting into wheat, there are things like ergot. That's something we look for every time we grade a sample of wheat, and that can be very dangerous to humans if you get too much of it. And that's something where under the FGIS provisions, we report it, but if it's anything over 0.05% of the sample being ergot, we actually mark on the grade line that it's sample grade. And if it's sample grade, that means that it is of the lowest quality due to that reason. So it's something we make sure to call out a lot on our certificates if there's anything dangerous. And that's also the other reason for the FDA rulings is a lot of things in the list of items that we look out for them. They want to make sure that those items aren't getting into the food channel. And one of those things is having too much aflatoxin in it as well. So I hope that answers a little bit of it. I know there's a lot more to it, but that's on the grain inspection side what we do.
Great, thank you. Our next question, is it illegal to mix a truckload of corn with aflatoxin above the ppm with sound grain?
That one is a little more tricky. There are a few different directives out on there, and then there was one, it can go back and forth. So there have been times where there are horrible aflatoxin years where they have let that ease up just a tiny bit so that you can, but in other years it's very strict that you can't do that. I would recommend for whoever is asking that if there's an official agency in your area or if you want to email me, I can actually email you direct links to where that information is found since it does change a little bit more frequently.
Okay, next. Does your agency offer other services outside of the FGIS system of grain grading, such as organic producer certification, farm bin runs, seed germination, or analysis?
We do different things that are outside of FGIS. A lot of agencies, it kind of depends on the territory they're in and what their customers may need. There are certain things like I know, like for DDGs, dried distiller grains and solubles, there are different testing that places may need that other official agencies may do, but it is not backed by the FGIS, but we're able to have laboratory analysis on them. There are different types of like oils that we run that aren't backed by the FGIS, but it's done in the same protocols, just because FGIS doesn't actually have standards out there for everything. We personally don't do anything for organics, but we do work with a place to help people who need things with germination, among other items like that. But I definitely recommend to everyone that if there's different services that you need in your territory, to reach out to official agencies and ask them if that's something they do, if they're capable of doing it, and if that's something that they want to do. Because I know for us personally, I can't speak for everyone, if there's a need out there, we're really wanting to provide many more offerings to customers so that they don't have to go find a bunch of different places to do the testing. A big one that I see is non-GMO testing, and a lot of official agencies do that. There aren't any standards under the FGIS currently on that, but that's something that's needed quite frequently from a lot of our customers. So many of us do run tests like that.
Okay, that is all that we have for questions today. I want to thank everyone for their participation. That is all that we have for today's webinar. I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors, M&M Specialty Services and VAA LLC, for their support in bringing you today's webinar. And I also want to thank GEAPS and our presenter, Kia Adams-Mickish, for joining us today. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and it will be available for viewing on grainnet.com within 24 hours. All registrants will also receive an email containing the link to the recording. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, April 18th at 10 a.m. Central Time. Joe Schomer of RISA Power Services and Eric Dorn of Faith Technologies will discuss ArcFlash, a multifaceted examination. I want to thank you all for attending, and I wish you all a great day.